the floor where they drop like bombs. Faceless voices running all the cons. Digital whispers in a binary night. No light, no face, pure sound, no sight. Stories unfold in the dark unscrolled. Echoes of silence, secrets untold. Waves crash loud in this audio cave. No mic, no fame, just the sound we crave. Tune and turn up, let the silence break. Raw, unfiltered, hear the earthquake. No mic needed, just a vibe that's real. Faceless words you can touch and feel. In shadows, voices untamed. No need for spotlight, no claim to fame. Just a beat of life in a stream of thought. Every word a punchline, no need to be taught. Just listen close, no visuals needed. Raw conversation, unprocessed, unseated. Feel the pulse in every sentence said. No distractions, just thoughts in your head. Whispers of the streets, rumbling through. Faceless yet vivid, a world in view. No mic, just souls, connecting in flow. Pure and raw, let the rhythm go.
How can I make my Mac boot from an external SSD? I have a 2015 iMac 3TB Fusion drive that just can't load. The startup chime and external keyboard won't work, and the mouse pointer and login screen appear. Any button press immediately shuts down the computer. I plan to boot the computer from an external SSD. This iMac is my first Mac, so I have no experience with macOS's special partitioning. Do I just set the boot disk by adding the startup disk options? Yes, you can boot your iMac from an external SSD by going to the startup disk settings in System Preferences. Connect the external SSD, boot your iMac while holding down the Option key, and select the external SSD from the list of bootable disks to set it as the startup disk. This will cause your iMac to boot from the external SSD whenever it starts up. Thanks for answering. Do I need to run first aid on the internal SSD before trying to boot the iMac, or is the iMac's internal Fusion drive irrelevant when the iMac is booted from external SSD? If your iMac is booting from an external SSD, the condition of the internal SSD Fusion drive is irrelevant, as it won't be used during startup. You can run first aid on the internal SSD Fusion drive to check its health and fix any errors, but it won't affect the external SSD's booting process. Okay, thanks. By this point, the iMac has been running macOS from an external SSD for several hours. How do I go about formatting the internal Fusion drive? To format your iMac's internal Fusion drive, you will need to boot your iMac from the external SSD and then use Disk Utility to format the Fusion drive. Here are the steps to do this. 1. Make sure your iMac is booted from the external SSD, not the internal Fusion drive. 2. Open Disk Utility. 3. Select the internal Fusion drive, which is typically called Apple HDDSR or Macintosh HD in the list of disks. 4. Click the Erase tab at the top of the Disk Utility window. 5. Set the name and format. How do I wipe the internal HDD drive so that I have one empty disk in the iMac, if I'm booted from the external SSD, or is the internal HDD automatically erased by partitioning the external SSD using Disk Utility? If you want to erase all the data on your iMac's internal HDD Fusion drive, you can do so while booted from the external SSD. To do this, follow these steps. 1. Boot your iMac from the external SSD. 2. Open Disk Utility. 3. Select the internal HDD Fusion drive. 4. Click the Erase tab at the top of the Disk Utility window. 5. Set the name and format options to your preference. 6. Click the Erase button to erase the internal HDD Fusion drive. Thanks a lot. This worked. I wiped the iMac's internal HDD with disk utility. I created a second partition on the external SSD, so I can access the files from the internal HDD. I also have a third SSD, but this one is Windows. Would this be the external drive as well? So what I'm wondering is the external drive term specific to the drive you're booting from? Glad to hear it worked. When referring to an external drive, it typically means a drive that is connected to your computer via USB, Thunderbolt, or another external connection, rather than being internal to the computer's storage enclosure. So, your Windows SSD, if connected externally, would be considered an external drive. Thanks again for being patient with me on this. On the iMac, I wiped the internal HDD. Then I went in Terminal, and copied all contents of the internal HDD to the third external SSD, which is now the only one visible to the iMac, as it's running from an external SSD. Then I formatted the iMac's internal HDD using disk utility. Is this all I need to do, or is there some special partitioning required for the iMac? The internal HDD says it's now all empty. You mentioned partitioning. This isn't really the case any longer for modern OSs. I personally don't use any partitioning on any of my Macs. Everything is just one huge volume partition. For your case, I would suggest using the external SSD as your primary OS and data drive, the internal Fusion drive for Time Machine backups, and the third external SSD for Windows. If you plan on dual booting Windows and Mac OS, you can use a third-party program like Boot Camp to manage the dual booting process. Thanks for this info. I did some reading, and I guess partitioning is for PCs, mainly to avoid messing with the boot sector of the HDD, if you screw up the C drive. I have one small question: is it correct that if I want to install an update to Mac OS, this is only possible from the external drive in this case, or is there a way the iMac can update from the Fusion internal? Yes, it's correct that you'll only be able to install updates to Mac OS from the external drive in this case, since the iMac is booting from the external drive. The internal Fusion drive is inactive during normal operation, so the operating system cannot access it for updates. Thanks for clearing this up for me. If I update the iMac by downloading the update file and installing it, the iMac will still remember all its current settings and apps after the update, won't it? Or am I mistaken, and all updates are like downloading the full Mac OS and installing it? Thanks again for your patience with me. I really appreciate your help. If you update your iMac by downloading a Mac OS update, the update will usually not affect your personal files, apps, and settings. The update will simply replace the system files and add new features, while preserving your existing data. However, it's always a good practice to back up your important files before updating, just in case anything unexpected happens. So would the update then just update the files in the system folder? If so, is this different with the Boot Camp drive? How would that update when booting from the external SSD? Or is it more normal and simple to not go with dual boot, and just boot from the external SSD? If the need to use Windows is rare, for example, I could just use a virtual machine with parallels. That would be a lot simpler, correct? Yes, the update would update the system files, which are typically stored in the system folder. The Boot Camp drive would also be updated in a similar way, regardless of whether it's booting from the external SSD or the internal Fusion drive. Using a virtual machine with parallels is indeed a simpler solution if you rarely need to use Windows. It can save time and effort since it doesn't require a separate partition or external drive, and you can run Windows applications directly within your Mac OS environment. Thanks a lot. That's a big relief. Is there any disadvantage in not using the Fusion internal drive at all? Is it just a waste of storage? There are a few potential disadvantages to not using the Fusion internal drive. 1. You sacrifice storage space. Using the Fusion internal drive would give you more storage space, which could be useful for storing files, apps, and other data. 2. You reduce the longevity of the Fusion internal drive. The drive may degrade or suffer from bit rot if it is not used regularly. 3. You lose the built-in backup option. If you used the Fusion internal drive for time machine backups, you would lose this option. Thanks for your patience with me on this. You say bit rot will be a problem if the internal Fusion drive becomes inactive. Could you tell me more about this? I want to understand this problem better. I'm guessing this means the file system and file information can get damaged over time. Bit rot is a term used to describe the gradual corruption of data stored on a storage device, such as a hard drive or solid-state drive. This corruption can occur due to a variety of factors, such as power surges, electromagnetic interference, and physical damage to the storage media. When left unpowered, the memory cells in flash memory and other storage devices can slowly lose their ability to retain a charge. The likelihood of bit rot occurring increases over time, and if a storage device is unused and unpowered for long periods of time, the risk of bit rot increases. Thanks for this info. This seems to be a real problem. Even a hard drive can suffer from this problem without any power. Is there any way to prevent bit rot if it just happens over time? How does this work? Here are a few ways to prevent or mitigate bit rot. 1. Use a backup solution. Regularly backing up your data to another storage device can help ensure that you always have a copy of your files in case of data corruption. 2. Use a file system that has error correction. File systems like ZFS and BTRFS have built-in error correction capabilities that can detect and correct bit rot. 3. Regularly check the integrity of your data. There are programs available that can check the integrity of your files and alerts you if corruption is detected. I've never heard of a file system that can correct bit rot. So ZFS and BTRFS can correct errors, in case bits get damaged. That's correct. File systems like ZFS and BTRFS have built-in error correction capabilities that can automatically detect and correct data corruption. They do this by storing multiple copies of the data and using algorithms to check for inconsistencies. If a block of data is corrupted, the file system can use the redundant copies to repair the damage, making data more resistant to bit rot. That's incredible. I think Windows still has the chkdsk function to check the disk. It's a shame the file system on Windows NTFS cannot do this, in case of bit rot. Is it correct that this is just the difference between the file system used in Mac OS and Windows? Yes, you are right. chkdsk is a Windows utility to check and repair file system errors, but it cannot specifically address the issue of bit rot. On the other hand, file systems like ZFS and BTRFS used in Mac OS and other Unix-like operating systems have built-in error correction capabilities that can detect and repair bit rot by storing redundant copies of the data. The difference is due to the file system architecture design. Thanks for this info. I really appreciate your time. I always learn something new. I'm just making sure I understand your final sentence correctly by asking some questions. So Windows and Mac OS are using different file system architectures? If so, was this done because the file system on Windows simply does not support any kind of bit rot detection and correction, or is Mac OS's file system just more advanced in this specific area? You're welcome. Yes, Windows and Mac OS are indeed using different file system architectures. The NTFS file system that Windows uses doesn't have built-in error correction for bit rot, while the HFS Plus and APFS file systems used in Mac OS do. It's not necessarily a matter of Windows being outdated or less advanced, it's just different design choices. Apple prioritized the inclusion of features like error correction in their file systems to provide additional data protection. Thanks for this info. Does this mean that Mac OS has prioritized file corruption protection over performance? I seem to recall reading that ZFS is slower than other file systems. It just seems rather strange that a file system has been created that cannot just correct file corruption as soon as it happens. Or is there any kind of background check of data blocks that NTFS can actually perform? It's correct that some file systems prioritize data integrity over performance. ZFS, for example, is known for its strong data protection features, but it can be slower than other file systems. This is because it performs more extensive checks on data blocks to ensure their integrity. As for NTFS file system on Windows, it does have some background checks and optimizations that help prevent data corruption. However, it doesn't provide the same level of error detection and correction as ZFS or BTRFS. It's designed to balance speed with data protection, without the same level of redundancy and self-healing capabilities. Thanks for the fast reply. I guess Windows, with its huge market share, has simply not bothered to implement a more self-healing file system for some strange reason. I wonder how MS has determined that it would be more expensive to include a self-healing file system with better background checks, rather than relying on the user to regularly run some kind of tool to fix data corruption manually. There could be a number of reasons for this decision, such as cost, complexity, compatibility, or simply a different design philosophy. Windows is a widely used operating system with a strong focus on backwards compatibility, and changing the default file system could have significant implications for users and system stability. Plus, many Windows users might not care that much about bit rot, since it affects mostly long-term storage of data, rather than daily use. So Microsoft might not see it as a priority feature for their file system? Do Mac users and those who prefer Mac OS tend to care more about data longevity? I guess I'm wondering if one group is simply more conscious about data corruption and integrity protection than the other. I guess this also explains why one group of people might have more of a habit of doing regular backups. It's not necessarily about Mac OS users being more conscious of data corruption and integrity protection over Windows users. Both groups have users who care about it to different degrees. However, the default file systems in Mac OS, such as APFS and HFS+, tend to prioritize data integrity and protection. These file systems come with built-in features like copy on write, snapshots, and journaling, which help prevent and rectify data corruption automatically. This can make it easier for Mac OS users to maintain data integrity without having to implement manual backups as frequently. What are the downsides of doing incremental backups? Does it require a lot of storage space? If the external SSD where I'm booting Mac OS from is 256 GB, and the iMac's internal HDD is 1 TB, is it then much more effective to simply do incremental backups of my system drive and boot from a 1 TB external SSD, opposed to a 256 GB external boot drive? I don't really understand how this works, but surely it must make a big difference. Incremental backups are generally efficient for saving storage space, since they only store the changes made to files since the last backup. This is in contrast to full backups, which store a complete copy of all files each time. If you have a 1 TB internal HDD and a 256 GB external SSD, it might be beneficial to do incremental backups to the internal HDD since it has more storage space. Doing so would allow you to keep multiple backups over time without quickly running out of space on the external SSD. However, the process of choosing a backup strategy depends on your specific needs and priorities. Thanks a ton for answering all my questions and helping me through this. You have cleared up a lot of fuzzy questions regarding a few things for me. Thanks again. You're very welcome. I'm glad I could help clear up your questions. If you have any more concerns or questions in the future, feel free to ask.
Mics on the floor where they drop like bombs. Faceless voices running all the cons. Digital whispers in a binary night. No light, no face, pure sound, no sight. Stories unfold in the dark unscrolled. Echoes of silence, secrets untold. Waves crash loud in this audio cave. No light, no fame, just the sound we crave. Tune in, turn up, let the silence break. Raw, unfiltered, hear the earthquake. No mic needed, just the vibe that's real. Faceless words you can touch and feel. Hidden in shadows, voices untamed. No need for spotlight, no claim to fame. Just the beat of life in a stream of thought. Every word a punchline, no need to be taught. Just listen close, no visuals needed. Raw conversation, unprocessed, unseated. Feel the pulse in every sentence said. No distractions, just thoughts in your head. Whispers of the streets, rumbling through. Faceless yet vivid, a world in view. No mic, just souls, connecting in flow. Pure and raw, let the rhythm go. Pure and raw. Pure and raw. Turn up, let the silence break. Raw, unfiltered, hear the earthquake. No mic needed, just the vibe that's real. Faceless words you can touch and feel. Tune in, turn up, let the silence break. Raw, unfiltered, hear the earthquake. No mic needed, just the vibe that's real. Faceless words you can touch and feel.